On today's World Insight, China's response to new tariffs on Chinese goods bound for the U.S., with counter tariffs on certain U.S. products and a WTO complaint. What's the nature of this tariff row? What's next for China-U.S. trade relations?
Live from Beijing, I'm Tian Wei, and welcome to a live edition of our program World Insight. U.S. President Donald Trump signed an executive order on Saturday to impose a 10% tariff on all Chinese imports of goods under the pretext of fentanyl control efforts. China firmly opposes the new tariffs, which directly violate the World Trade Organization rules, and it calls on the U.S. to instead work on steady, sound, and sustainable China-U.S. relations, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson said. Meanwhile, China has taken countermeasures, such as filing of a complaint with the WTO against the U.S. efforts. It will also impose a 15% tariff on U.S. coal and liquefied natural gas, and a 10% tariff on crude oil, agricultural machinery, automobiles with large displacement, and pickup trucks, effective on February the 10th. Also, the latest media reports indicate the U.S. Postal Service has suspended packages from Chinese mainland and the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. So what's the nature of the latest tariff disputes between China and the United States? How could major powers like the two countries, China and the U.S., steer ties toward global economic stability and prosperity? For deeper insights, let's loop in our panelists. We have a full panel of 4 guests. In London, Radhika Desai, professor of political studies at the University of Manitoba in Canada. She is now a visiting professor at the London School of Economics. Welcome. In Beijing, we have 2 big names in Chinese trade. Tu Xinchuan, Dean and professor from the China Institute for WTO Studies with the University of International Business and Economics. And also in Beijing, Professor Zhu Jiandong, Unigroup chair professor at PBC School of Finance in Tsinghua University. Welcome as well. In the studio, last but not least, Einar Tangen, senior fellow at the Taihe Institute and chairman of Asia Narratives. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Now, the most important question, this back and forth between the United States and China, what is the nature of this quote-unquote tariff war, or some called even trade war, quote unquote? Let's go to you, Professor Tu, first. Very briefly, your call.
Sorry, there was a little noise when you are talking.
What do you think about the nature of the latest back and forth?
Well, you could say this is kind of a trade war. Of course, the U.S. Side launched the trade war against China because it imposed the unilateral tariffs against the all Chinese products. And in the name of so-called fentanyl issue, this is a very ridiculous, actually, reason for trade policy, because this issue is not related to trade at all. But the U.S. measures is very directly related to U.S.-China trade. So then, of course, China will take its countermeasures against the United States. Of course, this is an unfortunate development, but right now, of course, the two sides are in the process of trade war.
I will let Professor Zhu, also from China, to wait until the other 2 guests coming from Canada and the United States with us to talk first. Professor Desai, your judgment, the nature of the latest back and forth between China and the U.S.
Well, it's all about the fact that in the trade game, over the last couple of decades, the United States has been losing, and China, of course, has been making a great success of its trading relationships around the world. And that's why the United States wants to tear up the rule book and essentially start again. It's also about one other equally important thing. The fact is that the United States economy has been performing very poorly for ordinary Americans. Trump has won the election by essentially telling them a fairy story, a wrong story about why they are suffering. He tells them that they're suffering because of China and because of America's trade deficits. So he claims that he's going to resolve that by imposing tariffs. And then there is one other important element here. Trump is behaving as though the tariffs as if the U.S. imposing tariffs is going to scare everybody very badly. Now, undoubtedly, Mexico and Canada are particularly vulnerable. China will also, of course, suffer to some extent.
Right.
But I think that most countries, preeminently China, are perfectly capable of taking the shock, recovering from it, and proceeding if the United States persists in this extremely unpredictable and disruptive behavior.
Mr. Tangen, your assessment.
Well, first off, Donald Trump is not ideological. This is simply out of his playbook. Do not take this as sincere. I mean, he's beginning a dance, and his tactics have not changed since his first term. It's shock with some sort of statement, assess both the public reaction in the United States, which was very unfavorable to the Canadian and Mexican tariffs, and then try to make a deal. And he's going to continue that. So reading too much into this, there's no point. He's just looking for whatever he can get.
Professor Zhu?
Well, as expected, the Trump trade war 2.0 already started. So I would view this as shock therapy to the global value chain. Remember, NAFTA was established 30 years ago in 1994, and the WTO was established in 1995, and China entered into WTO 2001. So global value chain, now I call it the tripod structure, which in East Asian led by China, in European led by Germany, and in North America led by US, has been experienced for 30 years. But Trump wants to change that, which is a shock therapy to global value chain, not only to China, but to entire world.
Very interesting. So we have a whole a rainbow of opinions. Some say not to take it too seriously. Others say this is a shock therapy actually to change the overall supply chain structure of the world. As opinions are varied, we also hear from two famous U.S. economists, Phil Gramm and Larry Summers, wrote an open letter to the U.S. President Donald Trump opposing the use of tariffs as a general tool for economic policy. Take a look at this. The two U.S. economists pointed out that the primary argument for the implementation of broad-based tariff is supposed to be reverse the hollowing out of American manufacturing and reduce the trade deficit. But contrary to the repeated claim, there has been no hollowing out of American manufacturing. Industrial production in the U.S. is at an all-time high. Meanwhile, they argue the earlier use back in the 1930s only helped create a depression and further financial crisis, both in the U.S. and in other parts of the world. So what do you make of these, using tariff as a tool to achieve whether it's a bargaining chip goal or is creating a different global supply chain goal, whatever that goal is, using tariff, is that an interesting way to approach it, Mr. Tu?
Yes, I think the U.S. economy and the U.S. manufacturing has their own problems. But the reasons behind these problems are very complicated. But Trump has kind of superstition in tariffs. He believes that tariffs can do anything, can be very, very useful to save the U.S. manufacturing or to help U.S. economy. But actually, as the two American very famous economists said, the situation is very complicated. Actually, the U.S. has to take kind of comprehensive measures to deal with their own problems. Tariffs are not so useful as Trump believed.
The overall argument for using executive order, Professor Zhu and Mr. Tangen, is based on an earlier act, in fact, in the U.S. Supposed to deal with illegal drugs. But China certainly has disputed this reason, suggesting China is not playing a major role, but the U.S. Should play its own important role in governing issue in terms of dealing with the drug problem. Mr. Tangen, your assessment of the latest.
Well, it's ironic. The U.S. was part of the cabal of countries that was forcing opium on China over 100 years ago, and now they're complaining that somehow China is involved in their drug trade. The problem with drugs in America is why so many people want them. They're the ones who are creating this demand that is creating the chain of misery that's going across. In terms of fentanyl, it's completely wrong. The fentanyl is not manufactured in China. They're talking about these precursors, but the fact is you can use any kind of chemistry set to come up with these designer drugs. And the fact is, if you read the United States' own reports on this, they acknowledge that China has been interdicting on in all of these areas on humanistic grounds to prevent it. So it's just Donald Trump is not burdened by truth. He's just simply firing away at anything he believes the American public will buy.
Well, this is according to a 1977 International Emergency Economic and Drugs Act. To you, Professor Zhu, is this a sound reason?
That's just an excuse. Without this excuse, Trump will find another excuse. Let me get back to the letters proposed by the two economists. It is true. The U.S. manufacture absolute amount is not declining. However, the U.S. manufacture value added relative to the world, the share is declining by 10%, 10 points. So Mr. Trump is not satisfied by that. One thing, make American manufacture great again, is a consistent goal for Mr. Trump. So I think in that goal, make U.S. manufacture great again is always consistent with no matter what kind of excuse he's using. Therefore, I think he will use his all tools, all excuse to reach his target. But one thing I would remind people, that 6 years ago, Trump launched a tariff war for the first version, which after 6 years, many people agreed it has not been successful. So why he used this now? People should recognize that. 6 years passed. There's so many other policies, and he should not using this shock therapies to shake the entire global value chain.
Professor Desai?
Yes, I just on the same issue of the letter that Summers and Graham wrote. It's, of course, at one level, I completely agree with them that Trump should not be using tariffs in the way that he's using them. But the reasons they give are completely the wrong reasons. I mean, basically, they are repeating all the fairy tales that the United States top economists like themselves have been telling Americans in order to hide the fact that, as my colleagues on the panel have already underlined, the U.S. manufacturing economy is in deep trouble. It does need to be addressed. But of course, the way Trump is using tariffs is not going to do that. So what they're saying is, of course, U.S. manufacturing is not in decline. They say that U.S. trade deficit signals prosperity, but that only is referring to the fact that historically, because U.S. manufacturing economy has been declining, in periods of growth, the United States tends to suck in imports, and that leads to increased trade deficits. They also repeat other, completely nonsensical points about, how U.S. runs trade deficits because the world likes to invest in the U.S. This is completely false, more false today than it ever was. So I think the reasons are wrong. I think tariffs, of course, this is not the way of going about it. And you know what, like I'm saying, Trump is not going to succeed in this way. What he's going to do is he's going to deepen the mess the U.S. is in, and while other countries learn to do without the United States, as they will.
Professor Also to you, we see the U.S. Goods trade has been in decline. However, the U.S. service trade has always been enjoying the biggest surplus against any other economy in the world over the past decades. And we see that it's still rising at this moment, even though other players are also catching up at this moment. So what do you make of this actually a relatively exciting mixture of the U.S. economy? How should politicians in the U.S. better explain the evolution of its trade?
Well, again,
let's go to Professor Tu, please. Let's go to Professor Tu, please.
Okay, sorry. Yes, actually, the U.S. industrial restructuring has shown that the importance of services industry has been growing. So it also reflects the change of comparative advantage of the U.S. economy. So now the U.S. is very strong in trading services and the services industry. So the U.S. has been exporting a lot of services to the world. So it also has been enjoying actually trade surplus in services industries. So this is its own comparative advantage. But now the problem is the trade surplus in trading services is not big enough to compensate the trade deficit in trading goods. So the U.S. is still worrisome about that. But I think the better way for the U.S. is to expand or to better take advantage of its comparative advantage in trading services. For example, the U.S. should invest more to other countries to develop services industry there, and they have been doing this, and they could benefit from that.
Not to mention that many of the exports going to the United States are actually done by the businesses of Americans in different foreign countries. It's actually American companies producing these goods in other countries and eventually import into the United States, Mr. Tambit.
Yes, they do. But I mean, if you start looking at the tech industry, for instance, Apple, Microsoft, they all based offshore, and they unfortunately they don't always bring the money back. But that was protected by the very party that is now complaining about the lack of revenues and how America has to get back on track. I was chairman of my state's International Trade Council. This is many, many years, over 20 years ago. And it was true then, what the professors have said. We were actually producing twice as much at the time as we had 5 years before, with only 2/3 of the labor. And that has continued. It's about being efficient. The problem with the United States right now is that it has a workforce that is not prepared for the future. You start looking at literacy rates and you'll be shocked. You have almost half the country, it reads, at below a 6th grade level. How are those people going to get involved in the new economy?
So once again, it's an internal issue. Probably the U.S. has to work on its own system. I'm not sure whether that debate about the Department of Education would really help in this regard. But having said that, though, our focus is not about that. There's another issue in the trade. For example, in China-United States, between these two economies, export control. Some of the best products coming from the U.S. may not have access in China, not because of China, but because of the U.S. government decisions. Professor Ju.
Well, get back to the letters from the summers. I would remind again.
You guys keep on going back to that letter. Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, one thing I do very much agree is inflation, which is the big concern for this shock therapy Mr. Trump has already started. Well, it's a very ambitious plan to change the global value chain. But however, as you mentioned, increase the frictions between U.S. and China could largely increase the price and could impose the cost to U.S. customers, and which may result in the inflations that would result in financial volatilities, uncertainties, which is very destructive and dangerous. That is really concerning to me.
Professor Tu?
Yeah, actually, the U.S. Constitution prohibits export tax. So export control should be illegal in the U.S. But actually, in the recent years, the U.S. has been strengthening, even making it more stricter to control exports to China, especially on those high-tech products, which are very needed by Chinese producers. So we want to import more from the U.S. But the problem is the U.S. government is not willing to do that. So it also has some negative impact on the U.S. trade balance.
Right.
But the concern on the U.S. side is that the U.S. is afraid that the Chinese producers could use those high-tech products to make even more achievements. But actually, you can see in the last few years, without or with those very strict export controls, Chinese producers are still making a lot of progress. So I think the U.S. government really should review its policy of export control. And it's useless and it's not good for U.S. trade balance.
Professor Desai.
Absolutely. I mean, the United States has used export controls against many countries. Back in the day, in the early years of the PRC, the US had imposed such controls. It had imposed them on Japan and many other countries. It sees them as a way of essentially keeping its technological superiority. But as China has demonstrated, and as various other countries have demonstrated in the past, China today more so than ever with the successes of Huawei, DeepSeek, etc., that these export restrictions do not work. They make the United States a lot of enemies, and they produce even more formidable competitors. So again, this is not the way to seek technological superiority. The way to do it is to invest in R&D, which is able to keep up with the rest of the world.
We are also seeing not only the countermeasures of tariffs against some of the selective American imports into China as a response to the U.S. Blanket tariff of 10% extra on all Chinese imports of goods. But also China has reacted by filing a complaint to the WTO. China's Minister of Commerce, the country has filed a lawsuit to the WTO, and that is China's latest conduct when dealing with trade disputes. Earlier, I talked to the Director General of WTO. She mentioned how China's respecting the mechanism of the WTO and actively participating in the WTO's trade dispute settlement process. Let's listen in.
Members that have complaints or difficulties about other members' measures, we hope that they will use WTO processes and procedures to try to lay out those complaints. As you know, we have procedures where if you have a complaint, to launch an investigation, to show what harm there has been, you launch consultations. China brought a strong delegation that held a seminar here for the first time ever, trying to explain China's policies, to try to increase transparency. And I think that is a good thing. We need China to continue to do more and more of that.
Those are excerpts from some earlier interviews with the WTO Director General. And on that, really, how will this help to clarify the back and forth rounds of words and actions between China and the United States? Mr. Tangen?
Well, let's look at the Trump tariffs. They're aimed at people, his own people, actually. I mean, you know, price of fruits, vegetables, everything like that would go up. Housing costs would go up because of wood. What China's response has been very, very measured. What they have done is taken a bite out of the defense industry, saying we're not going to allow you to have these critical materials that you want to turn into bombs. And also, we're going to make sure that this hits big industry, not small people.
Professor Tu?
Yes, China has been very supportive that the WTO should have an independent and binding dispute settlement mechanism. So we believe that it is useful and it is very valuable. Of course, right now, since 2019, the U.S. has blocked the appointment of appellate body members for over now 70 times. So actually paralyzing the appealing mechanism of the WTO. But it's still, the WTO has the panel process. Actually, in the last few years, China has filed several cases against the United States, including the Section 301 tariff, and we have won all the cases. Although the U.S. has appealed to the appellate body, which was killed by the United States. But still, I believe the mechanism still is valuable because it has shown the world that who is violating the WTO rules and who is the victim of unilateral protectionism. So I believe that we still should use this mechanism.
My last question. Earlier, we have been hearing mixed voices coming from the U.S. side. For example, even on the issue of top leaders meeting or phone call, earlier trade advisor Peter Navarro of the Trump administration suggests there will be an immediate phone call between the two leaders of the two countries. And then Mr. Trump on camera suggesting he's not in a hurry, only at appropriate time. That's a direct quote coming from the U.S. president. We also hear very mixed picture about the reason why the tariff is being exerted on China. Earlier quoting in the official paper suggesting it's fentanyl, and then suggesting there's a huge trade deficit between China and the United States. And there are other issues that the U.S. Keep on using in order to support its latest tariffs. So it's very mixed voices and confusing reasons. How should we, really understand all of these confusion right now coming from Washington, Professor Zhu? Do you have a good idea?
Well, we know the Mr. Trump actually changed his idea very frequently, right? And he's continually to change his policy. So we still hear he's imposing the trade frictions on the digital trade to China, and also TikTok issues is not solved yet, and he continually to change his policies. But for China side, I think we needed to see how his policy ongoing. Yeah. We take WTO rules very seriously. We needed to respond very seriously. Right. So we probably will see how the Trump administration continue to for his policy. His policy is still ongoing. We needed to wait to see.
All right. Last 30 seconds. Let's give to Professor Desai. 30 seconds, ma'am.
Well, I think that as some of my other colleagues have already said on this panel, Trump is not always to be taken seriously. He wants to behave like an abusive bully, where his aim is to keep his victims always off balance, not knowing how to deal with him, not knowing what to do. But I think that the rest of the world, particularly important trade partners of the United States, such as China, Canada, Mexico, have simply to make sure that they look after themselves and essentially, make sure that they put forward terms in which if Trump comes to a sensible position, they can negotiate. If not,
we have to wrap up. This is a live show, and that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight. Check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on X and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for being with us. Bye for now.